In May of 2024, I returned to Point Pleasant. I hadn't been there since the 2019 Mothman Festival in September. I wanted to see what had changed about the town since then. Point Pleasant, West Virginia is of course the main location of the reported Mothman sightings of 1966 and 1967. In the early 2000s, with the Mothman Prophecies movie, the town began to slowly change. Jeff Wamsley's record store, Criminal Records, transformed into the Mothman Museum. Bob Roach built a Mothman statue for Main Street. Carolyn Harris, owner of the Harris Steakhouse, or Mothman Diner, worked with Wamsley to create the Mothman Festival, which was held every year, until 2020 of course, due to the pandemic. I've been visiting Point Pleasant regularly since early 2016. I witnessed how stores on Main Street changed over time. Carolyn Harris died in December of 2016 at the age of 74, and the Mothman Diner closed. The Point Pleasant River Museum, which held artifacts of the Silver Bridge collapse, suffered a fire. The Navy Poster Museum, which held a Mothman mannequin as a stowaway, packed up and moved along. I stayed a few times in the historic and supposedly haunted Lowe Hotel, or Mothman Hotel. I saw many guest speakers in movies in the now closed State Theater before it was for sale. I toured the Mothman Museum and visited the TNT area countless times. I attended every Mothman festival from 2016 to 2019. With the pandemic, I wasn't able to visit my home away from home for quite a while. In the meantime, I heard of some of the things that were added, namely a Mothman mini-golf course. In May of 2024, I was finally back in the Mothman town, and that was my first stop. Right next door to the Mothman Museum was now a place called the Point Pleasant Trading Company. Within the building was a large gift shop of various folklore-themed items, ranging from UFO to Sasquatch stuff, and including classic West Virginia monsters like the Flatwoods Monster and the Mothman, of course. There was also a Bigfoot standee which made noise when you approached it for a photo, which I found pretty fun. That's cool. That's cool. Upstairs was the Mothman-themed glow-in-the-dark mini-golf course. The course was 9 holes and was decorated with various UFO and Mothman-themed decorations, including Men in Black mannequins and wall art. Both the course and the trading company seem to have a thing for the Gill Man, or creature from the Black Lagoon. From the 1954 film of the same name, which happens to be one of my favorite movies of all time. I'm not exactly sure why the Gill Man would be hanging out with Mothman and Sasquatch, but for me it's a welcome addition. My Flatwoods Monster shirt lit up under the black light and was glowing pink. The golf course had audio speakers producing a soundscape as you played. The narrative of the course was that Mothman escapes and invades the town along with UFOs while authorities attack him. In one room, there was a diner with a reference to Carolyn Harris. At the end of the course, a Mothman animatronic was activated. It was a fun mini-golf course, and I would say it was very well done. The next place I wanted to check out was the Mason Jar, which was next door to the trading company. The Mason Jar is essentially a thrift shop, which I'm a big fan of. I usually check out the place when I'm in town to see what they have, as their items are always changing. I once even saw an old Ouija board in there during the Mothman Festival, but it didn't last long in the crowd of spooky visitors with an affinity for the paranormal. Also, who doesn't love porcelain dolls? Well, I guess a lot of people don't, but I do. Those are the kind of dolls that people are afraid of for whatever reason, perhaps it's their age. I've always wanted to get one. Who knows, maybe it would be haunted. That'd be a fun treat. I wasn't able to pick one up on this trip, however. I like to film a lot of the items in this store that I know I'll never buy, just because they look cool. A way to remember what was there and prevent myself from spending needlessly. Forgive me if I ramble here to fill more time so that I can add more footage of the store. Have you ever heard The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe? I think it goes something like this. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered, weak and weary, over a many acquainted curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some late visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more. Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wroth its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I sought to borrow, from these books succinct of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken sad uncertain, rustling of each purple curtain, thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never thought before. So to still my heart from beating, I stood repeating, "'Tis some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, surely your forgiveness I implore, but you see I was napping, and so gently you came tapping, and so faintly you came rapping, I scarcely sure I heard you." Here opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Okay, moving swiftly on. As always, I paid a visit to my old friend, the Mothman statue. The Mothman statue has somehow become even more of an internet meme than usual since I was last here. In 2019, it was featured in the video game Fallout 76, which had a Mothman cult. Apparently over 2020, people began bringing beans as an offering to the statue. That kind of thing wasn't typically done before, which ultimately led to a wooden Mothman mutual aid station, where people essentially donated beans to whoever would want them. What a world, what a world. The fact that the statue has a behind was always an occasional point of humor. I remember the lady at the counter in the Low Hotel once saying, "You can go check out the Mothman statue, he's got buns of steel." But recently the joke has really taken off and become very one note. I recall the lines to take a photo with the Mothman statue during the festival in the 2010s, but now in the 2020s it would seem there are two lines, a photo in front and a photo in back. You truly never know what the internet will be obsessed with next, and I try to let them have their fun. Jeff Wamsley has put out 2 books on the creature entitled Mothman: The Facts Behind the Legend and Mothman Behind the Red Eyes. I've long said that he should entitle his 3rd one Mothman Behind the Grey Wings, to finish the Mothman's Behind trilogy. While I was at the statue, I even appeared on the Moth Cam, which is now a YouTube stream run by Jimmy of Spooky Appalachia, a friend and fellow researcher of West Virginia weirdness and folklore stories. Then onward I went to the Mothman Museum to see how it's changed. I heard that they did some remodeling and reorganizing, namely adding 2 new rooms. The Mothman Museum gift shop looked pretty much the same as it ever was, though I must say I'm surprised to see them lean into the boyfriend merchandise, which seemed to once again stem from recent internet trends. The museum consists of a few things. First, Mothman newspaper clippings, provided to Jeff mostly by Linda Scarberry and other collectors of newspapers. Second is the original handwritten reports of the November 15, 1966 sightings from the Scarberry and Mallets, which was also provided by Linda, whom Jeff interviewed for his first book in the early 2000s. His book also features these handwritten reports in its pages. Third in the museum is a bunch of Mothman props from the Mothman Prophecies movie, which were purchased by Butch Kane, a local of Kittanning, Pennsylvania, where the movie was filmed, who later donated them to the museum. Other than that, the museum of course has information standees, mannequin photo ops, a few artifacts related to the Silver Bridge, newspaper clippings on that event, the Mothman Prophecies author John Keel's white jacket from the 2003 Mothman Festival, and the Woodrow Derenberger audio tapes about Indrid Cold, which were loaned by paranormal researcher Susan Shepard. When I first visited the Mothman Museum, there was a backroom theater which was always playing the 2002 Search for the Mothman documentary. After the Harris Steakhouse closed, that room became a tribute to Carolyn Harris. Since then, the museum building has expanded back into the storage space to make room for a new mini theater and another Mothman photo op. Another room was added as well, which seems to be the designated John Keel area, and a space to more prominently display the original edition books from the era, plus more pop culture artifacts, etc. There was also now a newspaper display of a bunch of old UFO reports from the time, which was a cool addition. They must have accumulated those clippings and items but not had a space for them until recently. It was neat to see that, but it was nothing earth-shaking. The museum was mostly as it had been before, despite those minor additions. One change I didn't much care for. When I first went there in 2016, there was an old wooden desk with a light green typewriter, an old camera with a flashbulb, and an old notebook of scribblings. An information standee was leaning up against it to inform the museum goers about Point Pleasant reporter Mary Hyre. These items were obviously just decoration. They weren't actually Mary's, they just set the scene, so to speak. They invited the visitor to imagine the life of being a small-town reporter working on the Mothman case and cataloging UFOs back in 1966. That part stuck with me, as Mary Hyre was something of a personal hero of mine, as a fellow researcher of local Appalachian folklore. When I returned to the Mothman Museum in May of 2024, I saw that the John Keel section was now the location of the old desk and typewriter, as if setting the scene for him instead. Mary Hyre's information standee was now tucked away in a small alcove near the entrance to the diner and theater sections. The dark glare on the picture frame made it hard to read, but there was now a full section of Mary Hyre's newspaper column from the late 1960s, hanging on an angle on the wall above. It was great that they had those clippings together there in a frame, but it was a shame that they were in such an awkward reading position. I had to move the standee out of the way to get to them. As much as I'm a fan of John Keel's work, I liked it a lot better when the desk looked like it belonged to Mary, since Keel already has his jacket in place and all. They continue to make renovations on the museum, so hopefully Mary Hyre will one day have her own prominent and readable section there. The upstairs of the museum is something that will supposedly be accessible at some point. I've been told they're working on a Mothman escape room there, which sounds very interesting. Another new addition to the town was Bunker 304. 304 is the area code for West Virginia phone numbers, and bunkers are a reference to the TNT area, which I've been to dozens of times, but didn't go on this trip. The store seemed to be an intentional throwback to the 1970s, with an Iron Maiden pinball machine, tie-dye shirts, band posters, and Kiss merchandise. Though I must say, their record selection left something to be desired. How could they not have Thriller, I wondered. I at least liked their Zoltaire fortune-telling machine. Other than that, nothing really caught my eye there.
What are you waiting for? Come on over. For a small fee, Zoltar will give you a wealth of wisdom.
There was also a Mothman ice cream shop. With all these Mothman-themed shops, it would seem that the Mothman is slowly devouring Main Street. I noticed that the River Museum had gotten a new building with a fancy-looking sign out front. I went in and had a look around. I wanted to see what had survived the fire. The main thing that was on my mind was the historic photos from the Silver Bridge collapse, and a very special artifact that the River Museum used to have before the fire, which was an eye bar from the Silver Bridge. I looked around in the museum but didn't find them. The building was 2 stories now and included an elevator. Though I found exactly where the photos would go, next to a printout of the newspaper report of the collapse. The photos were gone. I asked the man at the front desk about this, and he told me that many of the pictures didn't survive the fire, but that there were digitized versions of them that had been reprinted, and that they were actually going to arrive and be put up later that very day. I always have such weird and spooky timing with these things, I tell ya. Studying Mothman, Point Pleasant, and West Virginia folklore in general just makes these coincidences happen, it seems. Then I asked about the steel pin eye bar, and the man behind the counter told me the strangest thing. He said that the eye bar was actually outside behind a garage door for some reason, and just hadn't been moved inside. He said I could go take a look at it, and so I did. That's the eye bar. That's where it is. This is the eye bar for the Silver Bridge. Wow. I don't know if it's been fire damaged or just exposed to the elements from outside, but it's rusted now when it wasn't before. Once again, what a world, what a world. While in the building as well, there was a plastic bag full of gift shop items sitting on the floor. I made note of it and moved along. On the second floor, there was a lady who approached me and asked me if I'd seen her bag. Instantly knowing, I led her to its location. I explored around the town a bit more. I briefly revisited the coffee grinder next to the statue.
Folklore, legend, kind of thing.
But it's been on order for 7 months.
Oh, wow.
Better to wait.
And the old Towindowee State Park near the rivers once again. Before heading to my next destination. After that, it was time to get something to eat. Of course, when I'm in Point Pleasant, I usually go to Village Pizza, which was formerly Tiny's Diner. Not only the place from which the Scarberry Mallets phoned the police after their supposed Mothman sighting of November 15, 1966, but also the location of the reported sighting of Mabel McDaniel, Linda's mother, who said the creature circled the restaurant before flying off on January 11, 1967. I'd been to Village Pizza many times in my adventures in Point Pleasant. Whenever I had people with me, I'd pose them a question. If they were to witness a creature that defied explanation, such as the Mothman, would they tell anybody? Would they call the police? A fun thought experiment I enjoyed posing to them, and something that the Scarberry Mallets debated before making the decision that changed the town's history forever. This visit to Village Pizza would be different, however. The location, which was once Tiny's Diner, had been torn down, and Village Pizza had moved to a different spot. It was a sad but inevitable thing. Bittersweet, I suppose. That old building, which stood in 1966, wouldn't have made it much longer. All things come to an end, it seems. So the sentimental and historical connection to the events of November 15th, 1966 were now pretty much divorced from Village Pizza. But the new larger location, of course, looked a lot nicer. The interior was a lot more modern and stylish, though I spotted there were some of the old chairs and tables that had been moved there. The torch had been passed, and perhaps then the spirit of Tiny's Diner continued on in some small way, even if not the same spot. The pizza was the same, still just as good. Now I suppose the place has its own sentiment to me, as the place I've always eaten at while in Point Pleasant, more so than just the connection to Mothman. Personal, not historical. And of course they do have a Mothman pizza, because how could they not? Before I went home, there was one last stop. As a Fortean and researcher of West Virginia folklore, sometimes I look through records to find the grave sites of supposed paranormal witnesses and fellow researchers of the past. One person, as I previously mentioned here, who was a big hero of mine was Mary Hyre of the Athens Messenger, who wrote the column Where the Waters Mingled. She documented and reported Mothman and UFO sightings all throughout the late 1960s. In the town of Point Pleasant, she was the lore keeper, the person to turn to if you had a story, or if you experienced something bizarre. The community trusted her. She cared about them and was determined to find answers. Mary Hyre's niece was also supposed Mothman witness Connie Carpenter. New York author John Keel showed up in the town of Point Pleasant in December of 1966. He worked with Mary Hyre on the Mothman case and interviewed witnesses during his investigation. Keel made repeated visits to the town of Point Pleasant, though he lived in New York. Mary Hyre was his eyes and ears on the ground, the person who would keep him in touch with witnesses and keep him up to date on the town's latest rumor mill. In 1975, he wrote a book on the subject entitled The Mothman Prophecies. The original title was The Year of the Garuda, a title which compared Mothman to a Hindu bird deity. The notion of the Year of the Garuda is still found throughout the book, and Keel closes off the story with the collapse of the Silver Bridge. Reading through Keel and Hyre's correspondence, it's clear that a lot of the material Keel used was information from Mary Hyre's letters to him, and her local reporting in the newspaper. The book isn't just about Mothman though, as it details that entire year of his life, from his arrival in Point Pleasant in December of 1966 to the bridge collapse in December of 1967. The book is filled with other cases he researched into that year, such as Woodrow Derenberger and Indrid Cold, which also happened to be in West Virginia, though in Parkersburg. Thus, The Year of the Garuda is perhaps a more detailed but less catchy title, the opening pages of which say that it is dedicated to Mary Hyre and the people of West Virginia. After the bridge collapse, Mary Hyre continued her correspondence with John Keel. She continued to send him reports of strange happenings, including the alleged Men in Black activity in her office after the bridge collapse. Her last letter to John Keel was sent on December 15, 1969, the 2-year anniversary of the tragedy. In January of 1970, Mary Hyre was taken to the hospital. In February, she died at the age of 54. Keel received word via telegram. I've long wanted to do a super in-depth video on Mary Hyre. It's one of those perfectionist projects I've attempted time and time again throughout the years. Every time I try to make it too big and so nothing comes of it. I say to myself that it needs to be done right and include everything, and that just delays it and inflates it. I've tried before but wasn't sure how to go about it. I wanted to get someone else to read her writings in a voice more like hers. In May of 2024, while in Point Pleasant, I visited the Kirkland Memorial Gardens Cemetery to try and find Mary Hyre's grave. My camera battery was dead, so I don't have any video footage of the cemetery. Only photos I took of the grave. There were a few cars there because it happened to be near Memorial Day. It seemed like trying to find a needle in a haystack. I saw that a lot of the graves seemed more recent. In the center of the graveyard there was a statue of the biblical scene of Christ and the Samaritan at the well. Figuring that was the oldest part of the graveyard, I started there, seeing as Hyre died in 1970. This unlikely sort of logic ended up working out, as behind the well statue and the tree, diagonally, there was the grave. I couldn't believe I actually found it. It was surreal to be standing there. In my opinion, the real reason the Mothman supposedly went away, or the reason that bizarre events seem to stop happening in Point Pleasant according to John Keel, is not only because his Year of the Garuda focused book ended in December of 1967, but because Mary Hyre became ill and died in 1970, leaving Keel without connection to the Mothman town. Case in point, in a letter to UFO researcher and prankster Gray Barker in 1976, Keel says that he's completely lost touch with the locals of Point Pleasant, and asks Barker instead to fill him in on any West Virginia strangeness. I suppose I should also explain the symbol on her headstone. The Eastern Star is a female subgroup of the Freemasons. A lot less exciting than it might sound. It's essentially a club for older folks, mainly based on biblical or Abrahamic, vaguely esoteric content. Still kind of neat though. Mary Hyre's obituary reveals that she was a member and received an Eastern Star memorial service. This is likely another way in which she was connected to some of the women of the town. Staring at the headstone, I could only think of what she meant to Point Pleasant, and the tremendous service she provided to her community. She was a small town hero, and without her, a lot of the Mothman and UFO stories that we know and hold so dearly likely wouldn't have been recorded, or wouldn't have been documented so well and so thoroughly. I'm glad that Mary Hyre was there back in 1966, and in some small way, I try to continue what she was doing, to document the strange, the bizarre, and the anomalous. Paranormal researchers of the past, present, and future all share the same goal and are a part of the same undertaking or the same story. After paying my respects, I headed back to the vehicle. It was time to head home, exiting through Point Pleasant, with farmland on either side and UFOs circling in my head. What a wonderland of rural imagination it is. I'd seen all the things I'd come to see, updated my mental picture of Point Pleasant. I saw what has changed and what hasn't. I left the Mothman town once again, and I'm sure the moment I turned my head is the exact moment that a Sasquatch peeked out from every tree and the Mothman flew past the moon. I took off just before the visitors from Lanulus came down, offering their free flying saucer rides. I just missed them. Oh well. Maybe next time. And as I usually say, thanks for watching. Mountaineers are always free.